Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to today's Hammer Conversation with Connie Butler and Lari Pittman. Before we begin, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and I want to mention that we have many, many performances, screenings, talks, and other programs that you might be interested in, so please be sure to take home our fall Hammer calendar with you. There's a few I want to mention particularly. Writers Susan Orlean and Roxane Gay will be here on Wednesday night talking about the importance of libraries. Artist Hannah Black will give a talk on Thursday night, and we have a Hammer Forum on the impeachment proceedings on October 22nd, and a series of talks on Van Gogh by art historian and former Getty director John Walsh. So hopefully something for everyone. But on to today's conversation. I'm going to give a short introduction of our two wonderful speakers and then turn it over to them. Connie Butler is the chief curator here at the Hammer Museum. From 2006 to 2013, she was chief curator of drawings at MoMA, where she co-curated the first major Lygia Clark retrospective in the United States in 2014, and the exhibition Online, Drawing Through the 20th Century in 2010. She also curated the groundbreaking survey WAC, Art and the Feminist Revolution at MoCA in 2007, where she was a curator from 1996 to 2006. Connie has been chief curator here at the Hammer since 2013 and has organized many wonderful exhibitions here, including our Made in LA Biennial in 2014, Mark Bradford Scorched Earth in 2015, and Marissa Mertz The Sky is a Great Space in 2017. She also co-curated Adrian Piper, A Synthesis of Intuitions in 2018, which opened at MoMA before traveling to the Hammer. And she's the curator, with curatorial assistance from Vanessa Arizmendi, of the spectacular exhibition which opened here today at the Hammer, Lari Pittman, Declaration of Independence. This is the most comprehensive retrospective to date of this prolific Los Angeles painter and long-revered teacher, and it includes around 80 paintings and 50 works on paper. And there's a gorgeous catalog for the exhibition, which is available in the Hammer bookstore, and there's a sample copy of it in the theater lobby. Lari Pittman Declaration of Independence will be on view from today through January 5th, 2020, and we have a number of related programs, including an exhibition walkthrough with Connie Butler on October 27th at 2 o'clock. We've also invited artists and scholars to come and lead subjective, highly personalized exhibition walkthroughs, and I really encourage you to attend. They're really fascinating, and each one is totally unique. We have gallery walkthroughs sprinkled throughout the duration of the exhibition with artists Silke Otto-Knapp, Eamon Orahiran, Kathy Opie, Caitlin Lonigan, and curators Ilona Katsu and Rita Gonzalez. Of course, Lari Pittman is here today and almost doesn't need an introduction as he's widely beloved in our community. Lari was born in Los Angeles and spent part of his childhood in Colombia, where his mother was born. He attended UCLA and received both his BFA and MFA from Cal Arts. He's now a professor of art at UCLA and has received innumerable awards and honors over the course of his career from the National Endowment for the Arts, the California Arts Council, the J. Paul Getty Fund for the Visual Arts, the International Association of Art Critics, the Rhode Island School of Design, the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and many, many more. And he's been featured in important exhibitions such as Documenta, the Venice Biennale, and 4 Whitney Biennials, as well as major survey exhibitions of Los Angeles and American art, both in the United States and Europe. From his earliest experiments with collage and decoration during his formative years at Cal Arts, to the iconic paintings produced in response to the AIDS crisis and culture wars of the 1990s, to his present philosophical investigations into the history-telling of textiles, Pittman's works have remained some of the most prescient and influential of any artist since the 1980s. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Connie Butler and Lari Pittman.
We have some very Lari Pittman-esque flowers here somehow. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a total pleasure to be here with Lari. The exhibition is glorious upstairs, and I can already feel last night at the opening and on social media and elsewhere a tremendous amount of excitement. I think that people think they know Lari Pittman, but they don't, and I think the show is really a revelation, and will have a ripple effect inside and outside of Los Angeles, I hope. So we're gonna kind of walk through, which we did a little bit last night, in more or less a chronological way, I guess. We can start that way anyway, of some of Lari's early life and early pictures, because when we were walking through last night with a small group, Lari said many wonderful things, and I wanted to kind of prod him a bit and go back to some of those today. So I thought we could start with, well, this beautiful painting, but actually start even earlier than this, Lari, if you would, to talk to us a little bit about the early years that you spent in Colombia. And I'm curious about those years, as I'm sure the audience is, but also because it's my impression, and I may be wrong, that you have started to talk about your Colombian heritage and your Latino identity more in recent years in terms of the paintings than you did maybe in earlier years, or at least the critical writing around the paintings has started to account for that more. So that was something I wanted to pose to you as a way to maybe think about those early years.
Well, a part of, in response, well, first of all, hello. Hello. Hi, Connie. Hi. Part of the kind of discussion around identity, of course, certainly has accelerated. It's accelerated for very real reasons, but it's also increased levels of confusion about what constitutes identities, and also my anxiety about reessentialization of identities in the process of claiming those territories. But one of the things about Latino identity is that it is a consortium of all sorts of diasporic cultures that and races and ethnicities that simply revolve around a common language. It's not a racial category, and that's one of the things that has always puzzled me and troubled me in academic discussion and museological discussion. Yes, so for example, my mother's family was both Catalonian and also Italian. It's part of that late 19th century diaspora to Latin America. And part of the, so that's, I think it comes out of a need to clarify a kind of troubling re-essentialization of identity bases that I think doesn't allow for a really, truly, as it truly exists, a broad category and complexity of identities that exist with this rubric Latino. Also, my home language, I spoke to my mother in Spanish. I spoke to my father in English, and my father became a complete Latinophile and spoke and learned very, very good Spanish, although never lost his accent, but very fluently to my mother. So when you grow up with a bilingual background, let's just say it that way, as well as bicultural, but more importantly bilingual, it forms how you think, how you conceptualize, and how you visualize. So perhaps English can be better at some aspects of visualization, but I would say Spanish can also provide very distinct ways of visualizing culture and producing imagery, as opposed to locating it within societal or ethnic identity. I still go back to the power of language as the single most important aspect in how images are constructed. So that's where it comes from. And then also, when I was when we were living, we first lived in Cali, and I went to bilingual American school, Colegio Bolivar, and I hated it. I just was not happy. I had a very hard time learning how to read, and I would get diarrhea every day. And I would call my mother, and I said, "Pick me up." And she would always diligently come and pull me out of school. And then I realized my father was working in a small island off the coast of Colombia, Tumaco, and and there was really no school for us to go to. So my father and a Catalonian family and a family from Bogota decided to create a one-room schoolhouse, and it was eight of us in this one-room schoolhouse. And my father hired a painter to be our professor, and his name was Vicente Benavides, and he was a painter of religious paintings. So it was chaos. We were feral, but we had a plot of ground that we could cultivate what we wanted to. And some of my fellow classmates would plant a lot of food. We learned how to cultivate food, but I wasn't interested in that. I planted zinnias. And we took a lot of walks on the beach because we were on the coast and learned about nature. So I don't know, maybe that's the roots of, some sort of singular thinking or being left alone somewhat in early childhood to grow like a weed in some sort of neglect. I don't know.
Well, and the zinnias explains a lot about the flowers in the more recent paintings, I think. And maybe we can come back to the notion of kind of multiple languages when in later paintings, because I think it comes back very strongly a decade or so after this painting, Birthplace. So you moved back to Los Angeles in the early 60s and then found your way finally to CalArts after a short kind of stint at UCLA, and finished at CalArts in 76. And I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about the Feminist Art Program, because I think it's interesting to me who of your generation has chosen to claim the influence of that program going through CalArts in those years, and who hasn't, or when in one's career one claims that influence. I mean, Mike Kelly, for example, didn't, I think, for a long time, and then did in later years, and certainly sort of as of the late 90s. But you've talked about being influenced by Elizabeth Murray and Miriam Shapiro and Via Selmans, and kind of being adjacent to that program. But if you can talk a little bit about that, those years.
I think it was yes. I think I'm from a generation, age-wise, I'll be 68, and in terms of canonical contemporary art history, I'm from that generation, the pictures generation, although I had absolutely nothing to do with them, and I found many of that growing canonical moment to be was they were attending CalArts at the time. But I wanted to make paintings, not photography. And so people weren't painting. But that's what I wanted to do. And so the Feminist Art Program welcomed painting practices. And so even though as a male I wasn't officially enrolled in the Feminist Art Program, one of the founding leaders of it at CalArts, Miriam Shapiro, said, "I want to work with Larry." So it was kind of an odd exception to take on a young artist, but it was because I had elected to make paintings. So almost by circling around and by default, I became not part of that program because I didn't attend their symposiums or their seminars. We weren't invited. But by having Miriam Shapiro as my day in and day out mentor, I did. In fact, if anything, the pictures generation was very antagonistic and condescending to painting practices. They saw it as exhausted, a bit fin de race, a bit, retrogressive, reactionary. So I fired them.
Well, and I think, is it from those years, or I associate it with those years, when you started saying this thing that I love, which is that you have always thought of yourself as making useless things, and in fact, that the practice you have is useless, that you embrace that uselessness in some way. That I think of that as a response to, in part, to that sort of Academy of Conceptual Art in those years.
Well, because I think, yes, I think that maybe a service that my work has never provided is the ETA of meaning. And I'm not interested in that discernible point where meaning arrives for either me, the maker, or for you, the viewer, that it remains an ongoing experience that hopefully you ruminate on or revisit. And a type of developing academic conceptualism in the 70s insisted on the not only the staging of meaning, the staging and election of materialities, a priori text by which the work was to be made. And I don't know, I found that so Calvinist, that kind of almost, I don't know, it felt like a type of prohibitive and, I don't know, that type of protocol of assembly of meaning was so problematic to me. So I kind of went in the other direction, and to this day, I love being utterly useless.
I think that's probably the biggest gift that you give your students. It's why you generate students whose work looks nothing like yours, I think. But we'll come back to that. So back to kind of what was going on during these years, which is that I want to ask you a little bit about the year 1985, and not to sort of, fetishize these aspects of your history and biography, but you did mention last night and spoke about it very poignantly and clearly about this incident of violence that happened in 1985 and the sort of rupture that made in your work. So maybe you can take us through that and how you came to these works.
I mean, given the mess that we continually find ourselves with our federal government's inaction with firearms, resonates very strongly with me because I'm that statistic of gun violence myself. In 1985, I was shot twice in the stomach, and I shouldn't be here. But I guess I think my interior world or my emotional registers or psychological registers are such that I have a great capacity and drive to bounce back. I don't know. And I realize that trauma is something that everyone has to negotiate. Some people sink, and it just brings them down forever. I'm maybe a very lucky one in that it forces me to really bounce back. I have an incredibly strong will to live, and I'm also remain very ambitious. And I don't say that in a vainglorious way. So a way of dealing with it was through the work. How lucky, how lucky to be able to be an artist and have that as a tool, to, I don't know, negotiate certain things or dilemmas. I was always an atheist since I was 13. I declared my atheism at that age. And trauma many times forces people to, or it could be a catalyst for kind of claiming a new spirituality or even religion again. But for me, it was the opposite. It clarified, razor sharp, clarified and reorganized my commitment to atheism. And I thought, how do I make an object out of it? And so I thought, historically, one of the most powerful objects made about remembering death and mortality is the memento mori. And memento mori means remember death. And I particularly love a lot of the memento mori that Victorian society created. You would wear a locket of your mother's hair, or a piece of clothing, a kind of a secular reliquary of sorts that you would wear or have. So this was my attempt to make a memento mori, but I had also, as I said last night, I love Yves Klein's sponge memento mori so much, and that I saw a lot of them at the Walker. They have quite a few at the Walker in Minneapolis, and I thought, what armature? I love sculpture. I'm a failure at it, but I thought I would attach it to a gourd. So it seemed very generic, because I don't know any culture that hasn't painted on a gourd or decorated a gourd. So I thought, in advanced late capitalism, I'll pick a gourd and see if I can decorate it and make it some sort of honorific memory to a set of emotions or attributes.
And I do think of them as you still working out your relationship to sculpture in a way. I mean, this painting has three-dimensional objects on it and things that come out of the, off the wall. And it might be a moment to mention, too, that I think it's right at this time that you had been working for 4 or 5 years as with the fabric designer Dongia here in LA, and that even incorporating those kinds of images and collecting scraps of fabric, and that this kind of collage aesthetic in a way that continues in the paintings until the present is born in these years too.
Yes.
So the theme, I mean, I think of the theme of violence as being obviously a very American one, and you have described this painting as being, I think you said just in the gallery last week, that everything that's wrong with our country is actually located in this, can be found in this painting. But this is a painting that was made just after, or the year after that incident, and maybe you can kind of walk us through that, because I don't necessarily think the imagery is obvious, as is often true in your paintings.
Well, I think that what the paintings look like and what they might be implying are actually opposite of each other temperamentally. Because the first reading, I mean, I love this when people say, but your work is so colorful or filled with life or very active or ebullient, or the surfaces are highly socialized in their comportment, or they're very talkative, they're conversational. Yes, I hope so. But that's a foil, I think, for, or a bit of a smokescreen on purpose to maybe exacerbate, ironically, a bit of the melancholia or the rougher discourse that sneaks into the paintings through and underneath that decorative foil that almost always happens in the work. This one, if you notice, there is a heart. If you cross the heart up, and it's using just simply the vocabulary of, so this painting is 1986, and using the vocabulary of abstraction, I've assembled a semi-automatic weapon with its own bump device in the middle of the panel. So in 86, I was already addressing the escalating use of these type of weapons in America. But instead of it producing destruction, the automatic weapon shoots out a heart. And and also a series of eggs, which within each egg is the potentiality of new life. And then instead of a white picket fence, maybe a really clear didactic moment really is instead of it being white picket fence, it's a black picket fence.
But I think that kind of neutralizing of these really charged images is something that is something you perform over and over in the paintings. That you take, well, we'll go not there, but maybe here, and sort of mining the silhouette in this case. So now we're in 1990. Which is the beginning, of course, or maybe not the beginning, but early years of the culture wars. And you take this very American form of the silhouette and all of the, the kind of baggage attached to that histories of slavery and race in this country, and mine it also for thinking about sexuality and power and violence, too.
Well, sadly, what you're insinuating, Connie, is that those issues remain and have always been mutually inclusive. Sexuality, the construction of sexuality and violence, misogyny and violence. That, in other words, it's not like I'm adding violence to the recipe as an additive, like extra pepper or garlic. I think that the construction of identities, the insistence of identities and violence are kissing cousins. And so it was a way, very early on, I guess it comes from being a young painter at CalArts where very, very few people were painting. I decided, okay, what type of painting do I want to make? And what has been left out in painting as far as imagery? And as a young artist, I knew the modernist timeline really well, the great canonical moments. I love that work. I still learn from it, but how do I make a contemporary painting? So very early on, I thought, let me try to put things in that we haven't seen within that modernist timeline. So it would be, for example, not covert homosexuality, overt homosexuality, because the history of Western European religious painting is filled with covert messages. But I thought, I don't want it to be covert anymore. I was in my 20s, and so I thought, how do I do covert information? How do I, as a male, advance my own gender complexity? But in terms of sexuality, that's not an issue because I'm a solid Kinsey 6. That has never wavered. But I think all human beings have gender complexity, and if you say you don't, you're lying. I don't see how centuries and centuries and millennium of human beings being produced, that they would always fit into that neat, clean, binary category of male and female identity. You might structurally, but maybe not always in your interior world. So this was a case of trying to make a history painting, but it's about love, and the construction of the top half is private identity, and the bottom is public identity. So at the top, these two gentlemen are enjoying a moment on the riverside, on the bank of the riverside, or how would I say it, on the bank side? But then after that's all done, they're back out in public and they're constructing a new bridge. So I think by insisting on overt identity, your identity just can't be from midnight to 4 a.m. I wanted to see what overt identity would look 24/7, 24 hours a day. And as a young man, I guess to this day, and my husband and I, Roy Dell, when we've been together since we were in our early 20s, we always said we want to integrate but never assimilate.
I also want to mention, which we talked about last night, the appearance of the personage of the artist in this painting, who's just high on the lighthouse there in the upper left corner, a man with a brush and palette. And he appears in all of the paintings in this series, and I think of him, I mean, of course, he's sort of a stand-in for you, but certainly during this moment of the culture wars, the artist is one of the most contentious, becomes one of the most contentious figures in the culture, too.
I know. Why were they picking on artists? There's so many other things to pick on.
Well, still are picking on artists, right?
I know. I mean, a painting's not going to hurt anybody. Come on. Really.
But I thought it was so interesting also how you talked about the way that the narratives in these paintings can be read, this kind of synoptic narrative that's read from, in this case, top to bottom or left to right, these multiple time frames or multiple moments within one painting.
You mean the simultaneity of time? Actually, I think that's more rooted, as I was saying, not in terms of the relationship of cultural identity, but linguistic identity. I think that's where Spanish comes in. I mean, if you know, let's say French or Italian, Romance languages, I don't know about others as well, but when you're speaking French or you're speaking Spanish or Italian, in your daily conversation, you use the subjunctive much more, the future subjunctive, the past subjunctive, the conditional subjunctive, which means that in your daily conversation, you're acknowledging different temporalities or different moments of time. In English, we stick pretty much to past, present, and future in the way we speak. So that simultaneity of events is so rooted to your understanding of another language, perhaps, as opposed to seeing it so rooted culturally. Like, for example, surrealism is not referred to in Latin America. It's called magic realism. So meaning that it's both, there's a simultaneity of events. It's both magical and realistic, It's not surrealism, which in the French term it means above or on top of realism. So maybe Spanish is able to construct a type of simultaneity of time differently from, let's say, English.
And an ambiguity as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, one of my favorite words is actually in Portuguese, which is saudade, which is one of the most complicated words in terms of an emotional register, a psychological register, located simultaneously within the past, the present, and the near future. It's a fantastic word.
So I want to go back a little, or maybe it's simultaneous, but this is a little bit back into the 80s just before we leave this, because I love this picture.
Oh my God.
I know. So from the Portuguese, but back to Los Angeles, and what was happening, just to, I guess, have a snapshot of a moment of one part of, the heart of the LA art community is there's Rosamund Felsen and her stable of artists at the time. There's Chris Burden on the left, Mike Kelly on the forefront, Paul McCarthy in the chapeau, I think Renee Petropoulos on the left, lower left, and there's Larry indignant with hands on hips in the back.
I know, grouchy.
Which I love. Grouchy, right, a little bit grouchy. And Alexis Smith, too, I think. So, I don't know. There's not really a question around this. I just wanted to show it.
Oh, my God. That must have been when there were a sprinkling of galleries on La Cienega between Melrose and Santa Monica Boulevard. and Rosamund Felsen had her gallery on Santa Monica, on La Cienega, I'm sorry, yeah. That was in the late 80s, early 90s.
But also, I guess, it makes me think to again, a little bit contextually talk about how this generation of which you were a part was sort of the first generation of LA artists to, in the early 1990s, after exhibitions like Helter Skelter at MoCA, which I think is 92, and a number of other shows, thematic shows like that your generation sort of gets, that's the version of Los Angeles that really gets taken up by museums and the commercial market as well in Europe. And so you have, a lot of your peers and you too beginning to show in Europe often as much, if not more, than even in the US or in New York or Los Angeles. So these careers that sort of go outside before they come back to LA. And I think that's something that's quite interesting about the 90s and sets really in motion certainly the market, but the Los Angeles that we know today, the
It was
art city that we know.
It was an unusual moment. I remember having a conversation with Mike Kelly when he was alive about this, of how art travels and why did this generation travel very early on to Europe. And I guess my thesis is that the Kunstprofessionisten, the professionals in all the museums were still from the class of 1968, that kind of ethos of the class of 1968. And they were heavily, heavily invested in maintaining a view of America as utterly dystopic and abject. So, I remember saying that, I said to Mike Kelly, I said, it's a sweet spot for you, because your work really addresses the kind of abjectness of American society. That's where I parted issues, because actually I'm not interested in the abject at all. And I guess part of it is why at that age in my 30s, culture was not receptive to a queer population, maybe as it's gotten better. I guess it's gotten better. I say that a bit sarcastically. But why would I want to embrace abjectness when I was trying to position my work and myself as a citizen more within the rubric of personal wellness and cultural wellness?
So then that, I think, leads very nicely into this group of paintings, which I think of as, and again, we're just 1 or 2 years later than the silhouette paintings, this next series, and you've always tended really to work in these very tight series of works, groups of works. But this series, I think, really comes at the moment of the early height of AIDS politics and the AIDS epidemic. And I think that the representation of the body in these owl paintings, and all of these paintings in this group have this magnificent, what I think of as a kind of multi-gendered owl. But I think that it's both a stand-in for you, but also very much a response to this idea of the body in trauma and in transition and formation at that time that came out of that crisis moment.
I guess one of the words that I like when I look at paintings, anyone's paintings or anyone's art, there's this term in my mind, is the painting leaking. And by that I mean is that it starts revealing itself by default, aside even from the intentions of the artist who made it. So just the idea of the leakage of meaning that happens in all works, whether the artist likes it or not. And here I wanted to actually visualize that leakage, that endless self-immolation of the body. It's the penetrability of the body. Also, I think the AIDS crisis invariably produced a lopsided view of and insisted on too much phallocentric imagery. And in a lot of these paintings, I wanted to show the self, the possibility of a surrogate self, and also the kind of didactic insistence on my part of showing what seemed to be very absent is the visualization of the labia in painting. I've always been intrigued by Courbet's Origin of the World, but what's troubling about that painting is that for the longest time, historically, it resided in the polemical territory of pornography. And that was really bothersome to me. So I guess I was wanting to do, well, we all came through there. And the paintings, although that's not a site of my personal desire, and I know nothing about it from firsthand, I still wanted to honor it as a site that I came from and that all human beings come from. And in many cases, it even says, get out. There's even the imperative voice, get out, come out of here. So it's hard to talk about this. I mean, going retrospectively, I was very involved. But
Which is why I put in this one, which Larry has called his most embarrassing painting.
oh my God, forgive me. I was young.
I've gotten really fond of it. I like it. And I like that it says sincerely Larry right in the middle. Like, I couldn't help myself, sincerely Larry. So, and what you can't see, but you see in person, is the incredible, honestly, facility that you're developing by this point of, that the building up of the white paint, which becomes like icing or something leaking, as you're saying, a kind of leakage in the painting.
I mean, if that imagery exists, like the F Me painting, or even the owl or the labia, it wasn't. I did not mean it in any way to be sensational. It's not. I'm always operating as an artist from complete centrality. So I don't know any otherness that way. This is the centrality of my experience. And it's not meant to be sensational. But then again, it also comes from what I was saying earlier, Connie, was that it was about saying what hasn't been pictured within the modernist timeline of painting, for example, more precisely of painting.
Well, and we'll come back to that one, but similarly, this one, which is a few years later, these fantastic once a noun, now a verb paintings, which I think of as a kind of rumination on masculinity, which in some ways all the work is, but there's this beautiful arabesquing, or that's not a real word, but this arabesque of this male figure who kind of dances through these paintings, is what I had been focused on, but then you were talking last night about the toilet and the the sort of project of making a history painting with the toilet at the center as its protagonist.
Yeah. I mean, I love history painting, and that's something I've always wanted to do, where you're like, I think a great history painter is Goya. I think Leon Golub is an amazing artist. Nancy Spiro. I see them as history painters. But, usually in history painting, it's commemorating a war, a defeat, a domination, nationalism, patriotism, war, and things like that. But I saw, again, in that kind of really deep conjectural spirit of mine, I said, well, what could be at the center of a history painting? And I thought, well, I'll build it around a toilet. And I don't mean to, I'm not being glib, because I thought this is just the most kind of abjected object that we live in day out with, and have personal physical contact with day in and day out. So it was a kind of commemoration of sorts, a different type of commemoration, not a war, but of this daily object. And so it's kind of building the narrative around that in a very jubilant, exciting, circus-like way. And then the title, again, once a noun, now a verb. I'm always perplexed, and it happens all the time, increasingly so in English, is when we make a noun into a transitive verb. So we're seeing that a lot, especially with technological terms. I'm excited by that because that means that the materiality of a noun can actually be mutated into a transitive action. So that's why it's once a noun, now a verb. And all of the physicality here is being proposed as it's filled with nouns, but we might be looking at them at the moment they become verbs or mutable in their identities.
I think similarly mutable, this is the painting that you were saying that the inclusion, or talking about the inclusion of the drawings, the framed drawings on the painting. When I asked you about that and sort of about process and including the drawings, you said that you've never thought of yourself as making paintings, that I think you said that you think of them as sort of thin-skinned sculptures? Something like that.
I guess maybe it comes from going to CalArts. There wasn't that kind of fetishized, unnecessarily essentialized identity base of being a painter. You were an artist who elected to do something. So I love my East Coast colleagues who are painters, and they really talk that talk. And I love it because at times it's a type of identity as a painter that I don't have. And sometimes I'm intrigued because it almost sounds like an Esperanto to me. But yes, I don't think I paint a painting. I assemble a painting. I cobble a painting together. I articulate its physical surface. And yeah, I did say that last night, and I've thought of that periodically, that they're really, really thin sculptures. And that's why periodically I've even nailed these physical drawings, frame drawings, on their surface as well. So maybe it's a devotion to surface.
Well, and then maybe you can talk about the assembling of a work like this, because I do think I just know that this question of how they're made, how these things are made, comes up all the time, and you're probably tired of hearing that. But it's interesting to me, for example, that at this moment in '92, with I think this painting or the Decorated Chronology series, that you experimented with digitally constructing and digitally making the stencils, but then abandoned that and kind of went back to assembling the paintings in a completely analog way. And not to make a statement at all, but you described it as so that you could regain a kind of control that I think moving into designing something on the computer or constructing it on the computer, you felt you didn't have.
I guess it was a moment where, I mean, yes, like for example, the typeface Hey, FY, SOS, RIP are plotted out and cut out from vinyl and then painted on, and that was wonderful. It created a type of expediency of production that I was excited about, and then in other paintings, there's even higher degrees of that. It's not that I don't make stencils still. I still use stencils, but I cut them out myself in a different way, physically, in an analog. And I thought increasingly, yes, digital assistants could increase production, but and facilitate some sort of shortcuts. But it raised very quickly kind of a red flag. I thought it could actually end up being a very bossy intervention into the work. It could actually start determining on my so-called on my behalf the eventuality of the work, or the composition, or even the formal conclusion of the visualization. And so I don't know, I got shudders down my spine a bit, and I thought, I'm going to back off of this. And it was really out of a keen protectionism over my own work, because I thought it could derail it somehow. So I went back to, I have, in the last many years, since probably 2000, so the last 20 years, it has been completely analog production. And it's not meant as a statement or a Luddite reactionary statement. That's not it. It's just like also quickly realized that I just simply get better results by going back to my analog skills. And when I get a little annoyed by someone who's been in the studio and asks something about the work, I say, I don't do pret-a-porter, I only do couture.
So then maybe you can talk just for a minute to push at this idea of the process a little bit, or the question of it. Like, where do you start with a thing like this? You start. I know sometimes. Do you have an idea of a giant
a thing like this? I like that, Connie.
A giant steaming hanging pile there of cultural stuff. Or with the text at the bottom, which you can maybe decode for us? Or how does it start?
Well, I really start from the very general to the very particular. So this painting started green. The whole surface is painted green. And that's just simply, when the old masters would talk about soiling the canvas with an ochre, it's just a way of starting. It's your first call, and then you have to respond to that first call, which is green. And
it's kind of bumpy reptilian green.
Yes,
also.
Yeah. And then I wanted a large kind of monstrous hanging figure. I mean, these were paintings done at the height of the culture wars. And if you go through the show, that big room there is the most panicked work in the exhibition. There's a high level of panic and hysteria in that exhibition. In fact, part of it was that when I was shot, the first thing one of the surgeons said to me after recuperating from the event is, we can't guarantee on any level the many transfusions that you've had from HIV contamination. And I thought, well, thank you. Thank you for saving my life, but fuck you. So that's what it is. It's SOS, but FY. So it's both this very, very passive-aggressive, it's called a chronology of insistence and resignation, the kind of simultaneity of opposites. You insist and you say, I give up. I insist and give up. So it's save our souls and fuck you. So there it is.
So I'm going to move along to the Orangerie, this is actually an image from a beautiful exhibition that Larry had at Regan Projects in 2010, as you see, in the gallery's former space on Almont in West Hollywood. And you, as you can see here, Larry painted out the gallery yellow and green with this kind of beautiful lattice structure that refers to the kind of architectural what I think of as a folly in the landscape, although it had a function, the orangerie, this European kind of architectural form. And then installed within that what was essentially a retrospective or a survey of drawings. So we've reprised that here. We've gone from day to night, so the color is dark in there. So maybe talk a little bit about how the works on paper function for you. They come after the paintings, and they, I think of them as sort of you still having, all of these things in your brain that aren't quite exhausted by the paintings and still have to come out in some way in these prolific drawings that you make.
I mean, if you're an artist that happens to make paintings, I think drawing, I know this from all my friends and colleagues and all the many generations of students, is that drawing is still, works on paper still remain an incredible activity within a painting practice. So it's just so integral to the making of the work. There's also something about paper that you can be more cavalier, more unguarded, maybe be more reckless, sillier, I don't know, more embarrassing, more throwaway even, more, yeah. But the whole idea of the orangerie, an orangerie is a part of, I love the relationship of follies or within architectural conceits. It's an architectural conceit. But it was also practical, an orangerie and grand houses in Europe where you brought in your citrus trees for the winter so they wouldn't die of frost. But in this case, I thought that I would bring in my drawings from the frost and bring them inside. So the wonderful thing about the folly of the orangerie is that it's not, let's say, a mausoleum. It's not a columbarium. It's not a grave site, but it is a site where you're postponing the inevitability of death to a certain degree, or safeguarding it or protecting it. So I thought instead of bringing in the fruit trees, I would bring in the drawings and hang them on it. But I was also very inspired by a reconstruction that the curator Stephanie Barron did at LACMA, which was an early, what was his name? Now I'm losing his name. The German artist.
Oh, Polka, Sigmar
Yes.
Polka, yeah.
Polka did an installation on a chain link fence, and I love that. And that really was very inspirational. I didn't want a chain link fence. That seemed a little brutal for me, but so that's also how the orangerie came out. Was, you get ideas from other artists, and it was that polka installation that was reconstructed by Stephanie Barron in one of her shows about postmodern Germany, post-World War II Germany.
These paintings from I'm just going back a little bit, but these paintings from the early 2000s are also, I'm thinking about the way you're talking about something interior or the interior life, bringing the drawings inside, but I haven't heard you talk about these paintings from the early 2000s, which are all of interiors. The figure is gone, although the figure comes back in around 2012, I think 2010. But this is a beautiful series of what I think of as kind of vanitas paintings. There's a kitchen, a dining room, a bedroom, but what kind of inspired this group of works?
Again, as I was speaking a little bit earlier, I like the kind of bittersweet nature, the commemorative nature of the memento mori. Then one of the things that, let's say in Dutch vanitas or still life paintings, you're advancing this kind of glorious exuberance of fruit and vegetables and meat and sausage and just the, abundance and a type of transcendence through material culture, organic material culture. But at the same time, it is a rumination on death. That's, so it's again, I love all through history the kind of cultivation of the bittersweet, or the calibration of simultaneous opposites. That's what, when people say, oh, this is bittersweet, you're actually negotiating a simultaneity of an event. So that's kind of where these came from. So it's both hyperbolic, exuberant, fictive, exaggerated, and chaotic and decomposing as well.
And did they also, a painting like this, did this also, at the same moment that you start spending more time in Mexico as well?
Well,
and collecting,
well, yeah.
For example, ceramics and
I
textiles.
mean, absolutely. I mean, Roy and I have traveled. We're also avid collectors, maybe in parentheses, shoppers. But we both collect a lot of ceramics. I love the history of ceramics. I mean, that was part of my education at Cal Arts, is instead of looking at the cracks of art history, so a lot of it we studied the applied arts, the decorative arts, furniture, interior decoration, all these things that would seem somewhat degraded as an impetus for making a painting within the modernist canon. That's why I love someone like Florine Stettheimer so much. But yes, it was looking at the applied arts and us collecting the applied arts as well. Textiles. Roy is an avid collector of textiles, so he's the curator in our house of our textile collection, and I tend to center more on the kind of topicality that usually happens with design and glazing on the ceramics. So that's that type of leakage I was talking about.
Maybe we could just speak a minute about this painting, which is one of my favorites in the exhibition. It's again a kind of one that refers very much to you, and is in some ways a different kind of vanitas, I suppose, a kind of self-portrait or portrait of you, The Making of a Boy. And I think this one is, you've also said, not referring to this painting, but it's appropriate that you, and maybe you said it earlier just now, but that you've always known your sexuality, but have never understood your gender. Or not that you've never understood it.
Well, it's complex.
Yeah, but it's complex, exactly. And this painting is, in fact, about the making of a boy. You've also said that you come only from eggs and a kind of matrilineal lineage. So this painting is this kind of beautiful pinwheel of a flower arrangement, really, or arrangement around this vase of these very regal women in the little tondos, and then nests of eggs. Mm-hmm. And I love that the women, kind of Florine Stettheimer-like, are blowing out these beautiful birds, almost like glass blowing. Do you want to say a word about the painting?
Well, in the same way that I was talking about the toilet as a centerpiece of the history painting, it's just, I remain conjectural. Like, what if I try this? Or what if I try to recuperate some sort of meaning when its status doesn't even have that meaning as an object? Or how do I reroute some sort of expectations that we've learned so well? And so I thought, we of course know that, at least up to now, that a human has to be conceived through an egg or sperm, but this is just a conjectural painting saying, how was a boy made from just ovum? And that's kind of what the painting is really insisting on. It's, I understand it's fictive. I understand it's an exaggeration. and there's something hyperbolic and exciting about the moment. And I myself get caught up in the moment of its making. And maybe that level of insistence in the painting is, no, at least for this painting, Larry was cooked up solely with eggs. So.
And zinnias, or the flowers, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we will go to this, which is one of the flying carpet paintings, so-called, that's in the last magnificent, very open gallery of the exhibition. There are 3 of these kind of monumental paintings, and yeah, they're from an exhibition that you had at Regan Projects this same year, 2013, called from a Great Western what is it? A Western Imperium. From a Western.
From a late Western Imperium.
Late Western Imperium. Thinking about, kind of nationhood and empire and the fall. And again, returning to this subject of violence, these and other kinds of themes that I think go all the way back to very early paintings like Plymouth Rock and American Place, with this, what I think of as these images of the American landscape kind of out of focus in the sights of the gun or the camera there as it focuses, these kind of John Ford-esque landscape moments that one can't quite resolve.
I think that I don't know, I was very excited to take on these carpets. I think that, going back to this kind of, that you've brought up, Connie, about this register that happens a lot in the paintings about violence, and then the visual comportment of what they actually look like. I mean, if we think about that conflation, one of the things that I think Western European religious painting did so beautifully was that to make violence more violent, that they aestheticized it. And in a funny way, doesn't Quentin Tarantino do the same thing, or Pedro Almodovar? So that's something, so it's not a perverse conflation on my part. It's actually looking at a long historical maneuver of conflating aesthetics and violence. So again, starting with my fundamental education on the applied arts and the decorative arts, I wanted to make these carpets. So this comes a little loosely out of an Art Deco needlepoint rug, because in most rugs you have a medallion, a central medallion or a repeating medallion. So in this case, they're what is it, Connie? The scopes, yeah. So in this case, it could be a drone scope or a rifle scope. So you're zooming in on the landscape. So nothing has happened quite yet because you're still focusing on your target. So yeah, so it's again of the strange bedfellows of the applied arts, the decorative arts, aesthetics, and violence, but to try to create a new carpet, I mean, in a way it comes from, actually the incredible carpets that were primarily made during the Russian occupation of Afghanistan, where there would be a prayer rug, but surrounding the border would be images of, what is their weapon, the Kalashnikov or something, yeah, or war or tanks or, so that I like that strange moment comes together in the applied arts as well, historically.
Maybe we'll go here as a place to finish and open it up for some questions, which I'd love to get you to talk a little bit about these books. We have in the galleries also a configuration, a grouping of these books. I think we have 9 of them on these wonderful tables designed by Michael Maltzen. And here you showed them again at Regan Projects with the paintings of Silke Autonapp, which I thought was such a beautiful combination, but which came, as I understand it, out of really a dialogue between the two of you. And I just wanted to mention it also because I think that these collaborations over the course of your career have been really meaningful to you.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I so admire the work of Silke Autonapp, and I was happy that you were able to buy a big painting of hers here at the museum. And in our studios were nearby, and one of the things is studio talk, with your peers. And since we were nearby, Silke would visit my studio. I would show her what I was working on. I'd visit Silke to see what she was working on. And no one would put us together. I think no one would put our 2 works together, but we put our 2 works together. And we are very, very different artists. But I think what we have here is both of us were proposing ideas of the landscape, the psychic landscape, the emotional landscape, the temporal landscape, the physicalized landscape. And that's really, it's a conceptual juncture, not necessarily so completely a visual connection. So that's kind of how did this happen. Here, we reformatted it a little differently, and we put the books in the middle around the 3 very large flying carpets. So.
Larry, thank you. I'm sure we have some questions, so
Thank
we'll
you,
open
Connie.
it up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? We should have some microphones here.
Thank you so much. So my question has to do with, go ahead, come. My question has to do with how you organized or how you have organized the bodies of work. Earlier on, they fell under a group of titles, I think. Did those come before the work or did those come after the work? First part of the question. And the second part of the question is, in those bodies of work, you have a similar language of objects that you utilize throughout the paintings. That language, is that something that you organized before or that come out of the work?
The title of the group of the body of work that I'm working on comes first, always. So, for example, right now, as we've been working on this show together, Connie, I've been working on an exhibition for New York in March, and the title came first, and the title of the show is Found Buried. And I only have a third of the show done, but that was the kind of titular provocation which produces imagery. And so the title of the show always comes first. It's an organizational structure, it's a conceptual organizational structure as well, but it's also a physical structure. I've never been a maker of just an object and then a next one and a next one. I've only made bodies of work or under the meta umbrella of a title. So that's how in a way it helped us organize the show as well, don't you think, Connie?
It definitely helped me think about the spirit of the show. Yeah, and I suppose it helped organize the show in some way. I mean, I feel like the paintings, and I've said this to people, that the paintings really want to be together. I think early on we tried for a minute of thinking, tried on different ways of perhaps mixing groups of paintings, and it just very quickly, to me, it was clear that that wasn't the right thing to do.
Yeah.
They want to stay together.
And quite honestly, if you start doing that, some of the work just looks absolutely horrible next to each other. I mean,
you can do it a little, but
you can, but I think it just comes from the kind of infrastructural organization of the work. And then, Cecilia, what was the second part of your question?
The language.
Or the objects?
The
or-
objects.
Oh,
So you
okay.
seem to construct a language of objects
Yeah.
in these paintings, and
There's a language of objects, but in each painting, the meaning of that object changes. So there's the image is the constant, and its signification is the variable from painting to painting. And I always think of Morandi. It's a painter I absolutely love, and he painted those small little cups and saucers over and over and over again. And those paintings are riveting. And the reason there are multiple appearances. There's this one fluted little cup that appears in so many of his paintings, but what he did in his studio, he would then say, no, this time you fluted little cup, I'll paint you a light blue. So that I thought was both the constant and the variable. So that little fluted, and that's something in looking at Morandi's retrospective, I think it was at the Met, wasn't it at the Met? It really brought home so solidly that idea for me, again, of how do you visit physical objects, but how do you arrange their cognitive language? How do you rearrange, their cognitive language? And that's what Morandi does. So the work is never boring to me about Morandi, even though it's probably no more than a repertoire of 20 little vessels, but each time their signification is vastly different.
That's actually really useful to think about Morandi with your work. I haven't heard you talk about that before. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I have a question. I was talking earlier today with a student of yours about this idea of not dumbing down the way in which you create art so that other people will necessarily understand what you're trying to say, but to always communicate in a way which was both true to you and as sophisticated as you could. And I was thinking about that with regard to modern culture, where we have everyone being fed different streams of information and different ideas, but they can only receive it in the language. I mean, you referred to a Portuguese word that you have a particular fascination with, and you're multilingual. But for a lot of people who've only really learned to communicate in a few very specific ways, still reaching them and making them understand that they're part of a larger culture, it seems to me like a very important problem right now. And as somebody who's either a sculptor of very, very thin sculptures or as a painter, I guess my question is, how do you take that media moving forward into the future and compete with Tarantino's or filmmakers or the internet or things like that? Because it seems like the audience for this kind of communication, maybe to some degree, is shrinking, maybe not numerically, but in terms of percentages. And it seems to me like it's still very important. I mean, one of the things I really love about your pieces is you get this real sense of this person expressing who they are, and that makes you feel, I mean, as somebody who's an observer of those pieces, like, this is another person, but there's still ways in which they're the same as me. And I think that kind of recognition of the sameness of the other, despite, whatever differences we may have, it's fundamental to us all kind of coming together to kind of create a better world, which I think is incredibly important right now. So how do you see the role of yourself as an artist and generations after you that you're teaching now in being able to maintain that kind of communication through this media?
Well, one of the things I see many artists that I've worked with, is one of the things I say, do you want to paint? Is that what you want to do? And I said, well, then accept how limited it is, how protocoled it is, how historicized it is, how formal its its thing is. How in a way, going back to that word, how useless it is. So, and I'm not saying those things as liabilities or anything lesser about it, but it's actually a wonderful thing to find freedom within constraints as opposed to freedom within possibilities. And that's, I think, still the beauty of painting, is that it's not about the world of possibilities. And it's not about competing with technology. It does it really well. I think that's why it has to be a temperamental fit with young artists who say they want to paint, is finding freedom within constraints. And there are other mediums that you don't have to deal with that mess. It's all about possibilities. So, I guess I still love making it. I don't know. I can understand that discourse about its viability or applicability or effectiveness, but it still provides and carves out analog space and time. Maybe that's the thing that painting can do so powerfully. It doesn't necessarily claim to carve out digital space and time in other way that other mediums do, or continuum of time. So I think it still does something very specifically, very protocoled, very structured. But it is, if you want to paint, it's about finding mobility and possibilities within those constraints. And maybe I might be talking then indirectly about the complexity of my gender construction. Put two and two together. Okay.
I also think that there's a way in which the the complexity of the imagery and the layered quality of it and the simultaneity and the flatness and all of those things, even the way that the text is used, that there's a kind of oral quality, that the paintings sometimes yell at you. You mentioned the room of paranoia and hysteria. I mean, there's something about them that feels incredibly current to me in terms of, or accessible to perhaps a generation that understands images because of digital media and social media and so on. There is something about, I mean, I'm curious to see actually what a very young generation, how they react, whether there is something familiar to them in how you enter the paintings.
Well, what's been absolutely thrilling to me is I love when newer language or newer nomenclature can forensically reattach itself to a painting done in the past. I mean, that's how we see artists being periodically recuperated. It's through language or different generations that recuperate it. I remember when I was in school, we looked down on David Hockney. And obviously, he's been fully recuperated, by many young generations of artists. So language can do that. And let's say with the owl paintings, I am so touched and moved when young trans artists have said to me, they zero in on those paintings really strongly about the mutability of identity that's occurring in that. And they say, "Oh, Larry, those are your trans paintings." Well, when I was making it, that nomenclature didn't exist. So I love that retrospectively language can reattach itself to an object and give it a new life. So I'm really grateful for that happening.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, Larry.
Hi, Judith.
Have you ever taken acid?
No. No. I know for my generation it's a little shocking, but this is a drug-free zone. Yeah, yeah. I know, primitive, dorky, nerdy. I know.
Yeah, right here.
I was just curious to ask you, a lot of your work seems to almost be a little bit prologue to, what America is experiencing. And of course, it's a very individualized view of the world. But how do you find the moment we're living in now in America? The political moment, America's position in the world, everything that's going on currently. How does that impact or affect your view of things? Or is it a little more of a classical view of continuity, or does this moment politically affect you and how you feel and how your art is inspired and you're feeling at this moment?
Well, given that this is a highly educated audience, I can only surmise that what I'm internalizing is exactly what you're internalizing as citizens. So I don't have any privy information, and I never have. It's just that I have a conduit called art in which to articulate it or translate it. I'm not a magicien de la terre, I'm not a magician or a shaman. That's not me. I'm just, I would say maybe what I'm sensing at this moment is we have internalized such high registers and levels of violence, almost as if it were sound, that we are a culture that is in the moment of a very prolonged, and it doesn't seem to end, of empathy fatigue. Or even, what's the new term about content? No, what is the new term about content? No, 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 no. The something like it's a new term. I'll remember it. But anyway, so I think that's I think where we're at, is how do we get out of this stupor, this almost somnambulist moment we're in. I think of early German expressionist movies, especially Nosferatu. I think we're all become these Nosferatu. We're somnambulists, and that's a strange and scary state for all of us to be in. So.
Maybe one last question here.
So when you were talking about the trauma of being shot and how sometimes it leads to a new spirituality for some people, but it didn't for you, it reaffirmed your atheism. Mm-hmm. What is it that makes you get back up again? What do you hope for in the future for like yourself, but mainly for, I think, the world? And and you kind of addressed this a little bit in your last question about waking up from a sleepwalking somnambulist. Like, what are we waking up to?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Looking for answers, Larry.
I guess I don't have a spiritual bone in my body. I really don't. And I know that sounds really almost antisocial, but it's not that. I can find plenty of reasons within deep secularism to uncover hope and to construct it. And the site of hope or sensitivity or empathy isn't just exclusively located in that territory called spirituality. I think it can be rerouted and dug up out of the depths of insistent secularism.
That's a really hopeful place to end.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.